Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today I want to give a brief defense of Zarathustra's Serpent, because after my discussion with him and the distributist that happened fairly recently, a number of Nietzsche scholars that I know were asking, what the heck? A putative Nietzschean who's in favor of liberal democracy? That makes no sense, because Nietzsche hated liberal democracy. And so obviously I have no authority upon which to speak for Zarathustra's Serpent, but I just want to give my interpretation of his position based on some of the things that he said. I'll be curious to see what he thinks of this. It is, however, plausible, and if it doesn't apply to him, I am sure there are other people to whom it applies, which is the whole reason I'm doing this at all. Now, the thing about him is that he's he's actually the first Nietzschean I've ever encountered who's actually an atheist. Most Nietzsche scholars that I know of are some version of theist, mostly Christian. And that puts you in a very different position, because the interactions you have are learning about the world and learning about Nietzsche himself, in himself, or what he thought. His coherent isn't quite the right word, since he did contradict himself. But still, his worldview, the way he looked at things as it was. That's not really the primary way that an actually atheistic Nietzschean would look at Nietzsche. An atheist's first problem is that here he is in the world and God is dead. Putatively. Assume all this. I'm speaking sort of from the Nietzschean perspective, obviously. As a Catholic, I affirm very much that God is not, in fact, dead. Okay. Assume all the appropriate caveats. So, God is dead, here you are, and you've got to deal with this strange, this world in light of that fact. So, the thing to do is to start, casting about and finding, how do you deal with this? How do you deal with this catastrophe in which the world has been deprived of all its meaning? Now, Nietzsche is, obviously brilliant, and he is obviously a good source, but that doesn't mean that Nietzsche was perfect. I mean, after all, Nietzsche is not God. And, he's not the Overman either, obviously. He's sort of a John the Baptist for the Overman, but the question comes up if if this is an actually practical consideration, because here you are and you need something. Is the Overman possible? Now, the Overman was supposed to unite all peoples with his new tablet of values to replace good and evil. But can you actually do that? Well, no, kind of obviously not. The only actual candidate for the Overman that exists is God. There's even a further problem, that human beings have some sort of nature, even if it's not, normative, even if it doesn't have a telos on its own. Nonetheless, we're all recognizably the same sort of thing, and therefore have some properties and not other properties. And the tablet of good and evil would have to appeal to us to some degree, somehow. It would have to speak to what we are. The only entity who would be in this position would be he who made our nature to give us, this tablet of good and evil. It just would not actually work for all people to be able to be unified in this fashion. I mean, there are desperate reasons to hope for it, but there's no actually legitimate reason to think it could happen. If you give up on there being one Overman, well, maybe there's a second best of there could be a lot of Overmen, where each Overman can sort of create a tablet of values for a group of people. Each person having their personality. There's some things that appeal to us very strongly and some things that don't. And so maybe you could have that sort of thing, where there are lots of Overmen, and the people to whom he speaks really well and actually can sort of provide this alternative reason to get up in the morning, this alternative reason for living, this alternative sense of meaning, could apply that way. And there's one step further, because that's actually asking an awful lot of people, and it takes a tremendous amount of work to do something like that. But what if you had a bunch of people working together, and together they were able to produce enough of a reason for believing in this tablet of values that they were pronouncing? And here I think, that seems a little bit more plausible. There's certain problems with it from the Nietzschean perspective, because of course they may not work in perfect unison. They themselves need some sort of tablet for this, but it was kind of a problem with the Overman himself. Unless he bought into it, he has no reason to actually produce this for others. And so that would place, by the way, a further limit on the Overman, that whatever tablet of values he came up with to replace, God, you have the problem of it would have to simultaneously convince others and convince him. He would be creating it and yet under its spell at the same time. That itself forms some constraints on what it could possibly be. Anyway, so if you go to this team overmen for particular domains, this actually is somewhat like what Alad himself, Zarathustra Serpent, described when he talked about popular culture. And how within popular culture you get these little universes being created. The Star Wars universe and its dedicated fans, and the Twilight universe and its dedicated fans, and the 50 Shades of Grey universe and its dedicated fans, and the Blade Runner universe and its dedicated fans, and the Star Trek universe and its dedicated fans, and so on, which actually has this property of a bunch of people working together create this sort of tablet of values for the people to whom this appeals enough that they are suckered in by it and kind of find this to be, to some degree at least, a reason for living. Some people actually describing more or less these things. Apple could be another one through their products. Anything where you see people who are willing to line up for days in a row outside of a theater in order to get in early, these people may actually have the relationship needed for the Overman. Or at least something close to it. Something, reasonably functionally close to it. And hence, I think, you can see why he could be a fan of liberal democracy in spite of Nietzsche, because having a modified version of what the Overman would be, this sort of team overmen, distinct groups of team overmen and people who sort to the ones that actually speak to them, is the sort of thing that you find in liberal democracies and not much elsewhere, because liberal democracy permits this sort of splintering in a way that very few other systems permit as well, at least, that we've seen so far, and especially on the creative side. So that basically is my defense for the various Nietzscheans who want Zarathustra's Serpent to renounce his claim on Nietzscheanism, change his YouTube name and so on. I saw that a bunch in the comments on our live stream. So there you go. There's my defense of Zarathustra's Serpent being a Nietzschean. Try to think it through as if your life actually depended on it, and I think this approach would make some sense. I'll be interested to hear if it's his approach. If not, I think it at least would make sense as somebody's approach as a Nietzschean, but, not quite a slave of Nietzsche. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at